Good day, economics students. Professor Chick Kelly. Last video of the Economics Perspective series. This is a review of the mindset that you should come to embrace known as the economics perspective. The purpose of this video is twofold. Number one is to review all of the principles and concepts that come under the umbrella of the economics perspective, and then to discuss why we're doing this. So why are we introducing all these principles and concepts? One is for your academic progress. Obviously, you will have an article / video or academic exercise related to the economics perspective where you are called to use these principles and concepts to analyze and discuss some circumstances in the world, whether that's conveyed to you through an article or a video. All right. The other reason is for your own personal progress as a human being and your understanding of the world. So academically, obviously, this is important for you to understand these concepts and principles, but personally, it's more important to start thinking as like an economist and to see and understand the world as an economist. So we started off everything with our definition of economics. Economics is social science concerned with the maximum efficiency, maximum use of society's limited or scarce resources to satisfy as many human wants as possible. The reality of life is economic resources, land, capital, and labor are scarce relative to human wants, and because the burden of scarcity is inescapable, we are all forced to make choices. And because we are forced to make choices, there is a cost involved. Make sure you put a big star around the idea that economics is a social science and that all of the principles and concepts of the economics perspective relate to individuals / households, component number one, businesses, component number two. Remember, that's the private sector, households and businesses. And component number three, the public sector, government. Rational behavior. Adam Smith. Human beings should act in their own self-interest to maximize utility. Utility is the happiness, satisfaction, gratification that one receives from consuming a good or service or participating in an activity. Right? For a business, businesses act rationally to maximize profit. Government should act in the collective interest of the citizens, which they are commissioned to oversee. Rational behavior, rational self-interest is not the same as selfishness. We talked about that in detail. Opportunity cost, the next best alternative. Whenever a person decides to engage in an activity or consumer good or service, there's always a foregone next best alternative. Start to measure your decisions on using this term and this principle of opportunity cost. Economic thinking is marginal thinking. Most decisions in life involve changes in the status quo. Start using marginal analysis. Most decisions in life involve changes in the status quo. How do we know if the decision is a good idea or a bad idea? Economists weigh the marginal benefits versus the marginal cost. The additional utility one receives from the next unit of consumption or the next unit of participation in an activity versus the marginal cost of what must be given up. Economic thinking is marginal thinking. Incentives matter. Change the rules of the game and human behavior will change. This is true for households / individuals. It's true for businesses. It's also true for governments. Incentives matter. People act on incentives. Economic events create secondary effects. We discussed a few examples of these. For an individual, we talked about the idea if we change the rules for grades and interest rates on student loans, there would be all kinds of incentives to get better grades in college. We talked about the idea of corporate taxes, changing incentives for multi-billion-dollar corporations and how they go about making decisions on where to build products and provide services. Economic events create secondary effects. Generalizations. If we're trying to make sense of the economy and we're trying to eventually build some economic thinking, we have to say good is good enough. In other words, tendencies are the norm. If 9 out of 10 people act in a certain way, because economics is a social science, We don't have the luxury of a scientist working in a lab like a chemist or a biologist that can decipher every single variable and hold certain principles and ideas perfectly constant. Right? We're dealing with human beings in the everyday business of life. So for instance, if the United States government provides a tax cut, most people will spend a good deal of that tax cut or all of it. So to make sense of how the tax cut will affect the economy, we have to go with tendencies of the norm, not the 10% of people who will save every nickel of the tax cut. Generalizations. Other things being equal, if an economist is attempting to analyze how one variable will change micro or macroeconomic thinking, we have to assume for the moment that all the other variables that could affect the situation remain constant. Now I know that's probably not a realistic assumption, but it's a building block, it's a starting point. So for instance, we were trying to determine how will a change in the price of oil affect the economy? Well, we're going to say, okay, for the moment we're going to assume that there's not something else going on. Nothing else is changing except the price of oil, because we're just trying to make sense of, all right, well, if oil goes down in price, that'll lead to lower gasoline prices, lower fuel prices, lower manufacturing prices for producers who use oil as an input to manufacture goods and services. So we're just trying to analyze how a change in the price of oil affects the economic outcome. For the moment, we'll hold all other variables constant. It's a starting point. Macro versus microeconomics. Macroeconomics is the big picture, macro meaning large. GDP, unemployment, and inflation. Popular topics of macroeconomic. Total economic output or production for the nation. How many people have jobs? What's the general price level? Right, these are the big picture items, the economy in totality, in the aggregate. Microeconomics, on the other hand, examines the individual decision makers within the economy, the individual components, and the competitiveness of specific industries. Now remember, these two broad divisions of economics are not mutually exclusive. What happens in microeconomics eventually affects macroeconomics. Positive versus normative economics. There is never any controversy over positive economic statements. Positive economic statements are true observations, factual statements about what is actually taking place in the economy. Normative economics, opinion, value-based, judgment statements about what you think or how you think things ought to be. I warned you should be aware. Economists, politicians, people in business will often interject positive economic statements into their normative arguments to make their normative arguments sound convincing. Be able to distinguish the difference between positive and normative economics. Obviously, the most debate goes on with normative economics. 8 economic goals: economic growth, full employment, price level stability, economic freedom, equitable distribution of income, economic security, balance of trade. These goals are difficult to achieve simultaneously because some of them are compatible while others are conflicting. Every economy attempts to achieve the 8 economic goals, but we know that there are trade-offs between these 8 economic goals. Economic fallacies. We talked about the fallacy of composition, post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, and correlation versus causation. Be sure to review in detail the fallacy of composition, the post hoc fallacy, and the correlation versus causation fallacy. It helps you identify when someone or some institution is attempting to make an argument, but their argument is flawed because of one of these fallacies. Voluntary trade. We talked about the economist David Ricardo, and we talked about the idea of people gaining through voluntary trade. Individuals specializing in producing a good or providing a service in which they enjoy some efficiency advantage. In the Do You Think Like an Economist exercise, we observed Lucy, the lawyer, and Adam, the administrative assistant, both were made better off through trade. Ricardo points out what makes sense for individuals also holds for the larger scale when it comes to specialization in trade. In a macro sense, it makes sense for nations to specialize and produce products in which they enjoy a comparative advantage. Voluntary trade makes human beings better off. Economic models. A great deal of our economic exercises will involve models, modeling, graphical analysis. It is impossible to put every single solitary variable into the model, but the model will include as many variables as necessary, and it will help us make sense of economic situations, whether they are micro or macro. Models are only useful if they help us predict future behavior. Economic systems. Every country, every nation, every economy must answer 4 coordination questions. What to produce, how to produce it, how much to produce, and for whom to produce. There's a 5th question, the caveat of how to accommodate change moving forward. Broadly speaking, there's 2 economic systems: private ownership of economic resources, capitalism; government ownership of economic resources, socialism. We discussed these 2 systems in detail, and we looked at that graphic that showed where we expect to see countries today in relation to these 2 economic systems, that most economies are a blend of these 2 systems. Last idea. Dr. Prendergast was my mentor, my teacher, my friend. Taught at St. Joe's University, took 3 of his courses. He loved this saying: you can tell an economist, but you can't tell him much. Economics is interesting. Economics relates to every aspect of being a human. Economics is important to figure out what's going on with major issues across the globe, socioeconomic issues in countries across every nation. Unfortunately, there's some gray area in economics. For instance, if you asked 2 PhDs, both economics PhDs, one from Harvard and one from Yale, good schools, is it a wise idea to raise taxes on the wealthy to achieve a more equitable distribution of income? Economist A might believe that's a wonderful idea, stating that the richest make the most money and therefore can burden a higher tax levy. Another economist might believe this is not a good plan because higher taxes will slow the economy. There's a lot of gray area in studying economics. It makes it interesting, but it also makes it frustrating. Familiarize yourself with these perspectives. Be certain that you are able to have a good understanding of all of these principles and concepts moving forward.